History has always been shaped by war, and through the ages, some battles have decided the fate of nations and still affect the way we live today. These are the great battles. As daylight began to fade on the 2nd of July 1644, the largest military encounter of the English Civil War began. A total of 45,000 men fought by the light of a harvest moon. This bloody encounter between Parliament and the King finally came to a close when Oliver Cromwell's Roundheads slaughtered the last of Charles I's Royalist infantry. It was to mark the beginning of the end for the King and herald the birth of our modern Parliament. In 1644, England was in the middle of a bloody civil war. Parliament and the Crown were fighting for control of England, and York lay besieged by Oliver Cromwell and a ruthless Puritan army called the Roundheads because of their severely short haircuts. Charles I called upon his handsome and dashing nephew Prince Rupert and his cavaliers to relieve the city. Both armies met at the great battle of Marston Moor, just outside of this city, York. Since the death of Richard III at Bosworth Field and the end of the War of the Roses, England's economy had massively expanded and its population doubled. After London, York was the country's largest and wealthiest city. This thriving centre of commerce and trade was a hugely important source of revenue for anyone who wanted to finance an army. A century before the Battle of Marston Moor, Henry VIII reduced all Catholic pomp and ceremony, simplified the Common Book of Prayer, and established the Protestant Church of England, separate from the control of Rome. But at the beginning of the 17th century, some Protestants, namely the Presbyterians and Puritans, wanted to take the Reformation a stage further to a much simpler form of worship. They wanted to reduce all of this back down to this. In the Protestant faith, every individual could have a direct personal relationship with God. It was more democratic because it did away with the special intermediary role of the priest between man and his God. The reading of the Bible had dramatic side effects by Charles I's time. Literacy and schooling blossomed, producing a new, upwardly mobile Puritan middle class who rapidly occupied positions of authority up and down the country, including Parliament. A fine example was the grammar school-educated MP for Huntingdon, Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell was a small-scale landholder from East Anglia who believed he was the instrument of a simple Puritan God. He wanted the Protestant reforms to go even further and reduce the power of the bishops. He felt that everyone, rich or poor, was equal in the eyes of God and that the Crown should govern in partnership with Parliament. Charles I, on the other hand, believed that he'd been appointed by God to govern the people on his behalf. He was completely out of touch with the new Puritan moods sweeping the country. Charles wanted to reassert the authority of the monarchy and run the country as he saw fit without the interference of Parliament. However, despite projecting an image of a sage and austere ruler, he was actually a very indecisive king and was often strongly influenced by unreliable advisors. Charles was a deeply religious man, and his plans to restore the wealth and power of the church put the monarchy and parliament on a collision course. The rising merchant classes believed Charles I was trying to return England to Catholicism and absolute monarchy by stealth. Without a parliament, they would have no place to air their grievances or pass legislation which was good for them and their businesses. The king implemented religious reforms which caused widespread disaffection with the monarchy. When Charles tried to impose an Episcopalian prayer book on Presbyterian Scotland, matters came to a head. Scotland was outraged and invaded England as a result. Then, to make matters worse for Charles, Ireland rebelled. The king managed to suppress these rebellions, but by 1642 the royal coffers were empty, so Charles called a parliament to refill the war chest. It refused. The king saw this as a revolution, raised his standard and declared war on his own parliament. 100 years earlier, the Wars of the Roses had been fought between two noble houses competing for the English throne. However, this civil war touched every section of society. The fighting was extremely brutal and localized. It divided families and whole communities. As the conflict intensified, both the king and parliament amassed huge armies. In response to the old feudal call of military service in return for land, thousands rallied to the king's side, just as they had done at the battles of Hastings and Bosworth. Parliament, on the other hand, paid for its soldiers with the taxes it collected. In the 2 years of civil war before the Battle of Marston Moor, both sides had been involved in major skirmishes, but neither had gained a significant advantage. In 1644, matters came to a head in the north of England. A parliamentarian army, 28,000 strong, had closed a fist around the city of York. The garrison, commanded by the Marquis of Newcastle, had perhaps only 4,000 men. The king knew if York fell, the rest of the country would follow. He sent an urgent message to his nephew, Prince Rupert. "If York be lost, I shall esteem my crown little less. Immediately march with all your forces to the relief of the city of York." In a series of superb victories, the prince made his way north. By the middle of the 17th century, armies relied on a new kind of military technology. For hundreds of years, the longbow had dominated the battlefield. It had now been replaced by the musket. Much heavier than the longbow, it was more expensive to produce and had a much shorter range. But the musket had one distinct advantage. Whereas it could take years for an archer to build the upper body strength required to draw a bow, the musket could be used by almost anyone. The procedure for firing the matchlock musket was complicated, but in the right hands, a musketeer could probably fire off 2 rounds per minute. To load, he'd open the firing pan, place gunpowder inside, close the firing pan in case of wind or rain, and then bring the musket down, where he'd put powder in, a ball, wadding, and then ram it home. This is all under fire, remember. He would then bring the matchlock up, making sure the match was still ignited. He'd blow on it a couple of times, bring back the pan, bring himself up into the aim again, nice and firmly because of the kick, and then loose off the shot. You can see how the match dips into the pan, exploding this powder here, which travels into the bottom of the barrel, firing off the ball. Musketeers could work as individuals, but they were far more effective when they worked as a group, firing in volleys at the enemy until they were maybe 10 or 20 meters away, smoke completely obliterating the battlefield. When the enemy became too near, however, this musket doubled up as a club. The infantry at Marston Moor were equipped with a whole range of ferocious-looking polearms. This is called a halberd, which is really a remnant from about 100 years before Marston Moor, and was generally used by a sergeant to either keep his troops in line or as an equalizer on the battlefield. He could bring down a cavalryman with a weapon like this. These pieces on the side were particularly effective. This one could be ground down the side of a horse as they went past. This could be used to smack into a helmet of a cavalryman perhaps. And the top bits here, when parrying a sword, could quite easily trap the sword and then snap it off. The spike on the front is self-evident and could be used against either cavalry or infantry. The infantrymen would be grouped together by regiment, closely packed, and then would advance together towards the enemy. What a terrifying experience this must have been, being faced with this wall of steel, tightly packed, poking into your face, slashing and gouging. Musketeers would be on the sides, on the flanks of the infantry, and they would fire into the enemy and then withdraw back into the safety that the pikes could afford.
Both armies used the same military hardware, but the parliamentarians that surrounded York were an alliance of different government forces from around the country, and unlike the royalists, had no one in overall command. The king's forces, however, had problems of their own.
As Rupert approached York with 14,000 men, he was faced with a dilemma. 28,000 Roundheads lay between him and his objective. But Rupert didn't want to just relieve York. He wanted to defeat the parliamentarians in battle. But he knew that to stand any chance of succeeding, he had to join forces with the 4,000 men now trapped inside York.
In 1642, King Charles I declared war on his own parliament. After 2 years of bloody civil war, England's second city, York, lay besieged by 28,000 parliamentarian troops. King Charles I sent his dashing young nephew, Prince Rupert, with a mere 14,000 men to relieve the Royalists' last stronghold in the north of England.
Although heavily outnumbered, Rupert used mobility and tactical nous to level the playing field. As he approached York, Rupert deployed his cavalry in a line within sight of the parliamentarians. Believing the whole Royalist army was deploying in order to fight them, the Roundheads turned round and came to meet Rupert here on Marston Moor, just southwest of the city.
While the parliamentarian forces were distracted by Rupert's cavalry screen, the prince forced marched the bulk of his army in a wide arc to the north of York and back round behind the unsuspecting parliamentarians. In one bold move, Rupert had duped the opposition and succeeded in relieving York.
A less impetuous leader than Rupert would have been content with lifting the siege and recuperating. However, with the odds stacked against him, Rupert decided to take the fight to the Roundheads. His plan was to launch a surprise dawn attack from the rear. For it to work, Rupert had to rely on swift, decisive action. Rupert immediately sent brief orders for the troops defending York to join him here on Marston Moor as quickly as possible. However, many of them were celebrating the lifting of the siege by getting as drunk as possible, and many others were making full use of the parliamentary supplies left outside the gates of the city, including 4,000 pairs of shoes, which they joyfully seized.
Their commander, the Marquess of Newcastle, was reluctant to hand over his garrison to the young prince and was in no hurry to rally his troops. His intransigence was to cost Rupert the element of surprise. Men from the York garrison did not start to arrive on Marston Moor until 5 p.m. As the prince watched and waited, the parliamentarians wheeled around to face him. The heavens opened up as a violent thunderstorm drenched the moor. The battlefield turned to mud as the troops on both sides took up their final positions and began to exchange sporadic cannon fire. The two armies deployed in fairly conventional order of the day. The Royalist centre consisted of 10,000 heavily armed foot soldiers. Dense formations of pikemen took up their positions alongside blocks of musketeers several rows deep. They were flanked by horsemen on each side. Byron commanded the cavalry on the right wing and Goring the left. Prince Rupert commanded a reserve in the middle rear. With approximately 7,000 horse each, the two sides were evenly matched in terms of cavalry, but the parliamentarian infantry outnumbered the king's forces by almost 2 to 1, 21,000 men against 11,000.
By 7:30 p.m, the prince decided not to begin the battle proper. And with both armies' battle lines drawn up within a quarter of a mile of each other, Rupert dismounted to enjoy his supper, determined to continue the battle the next day. As they looked through their perspective glasses, the parliamentary commanders could hardly believe their luck as they saw Rupert's cavalry dismount and smoke start to rise from their campfires. As day turned to dusk, the sound of prayers and psalms being sung lifted and filled the air. And in a moment of almost religious importance, the parliamentary commanders decided to seize the opportunity and attack.
Cromwell turned in his saddle and looked back over the three armies to his right and rear. His own cavalry were all around him, over 3,000 horse, with Scottish cavalry in reserve to the rear. Immediately to Cromwell's right, a huge sea of infantry, pikes upright, a forest of weaponry 18 feet high, had taken up the centre ground. Next to these pikemen, the fire-eating Sir Thomas Fairfax with 2 more cavalry divisions formed the parliamentarians' right flank.
Cromwell was the first to charge. Together with his cavalry, the Ironsides, he thundered down the slopes into Lord Byron's troops. All was chaos in the royalist lines as officers hastened to dress the ranks and troopers scrambled to remount.
The royalists had been caught totally by surprise. Reluctant to receive the ferocious tide of Ironside sabres while standing still, Byron launched an immediate countercharge. However, he advanced straight through his own musketeers' line of fire and prevented them from inflicting any great damage on Cromwell's cavalry. The two sides met in a clash of steel, but the well-drilled Ironsides had greater momentum and routed the royalist cavalry. During this engagement, Cromwell was wounded in the neck and temporarily left the battle to receive a field dressing.
Rupert returned to find his own cavaliers fleeing the battlefield. He rallied his troopers with the astonished cry, "Swoons, do you run? Follow me!" and led them back into the battle.
Just as Rupert's troops re-entered the battle, the 800 Scottish cavalry that formed the parliamentarian reserve on the right flank decided to join the fight. The timing of their attack was crucial. As the Scots smashed into the cavaliers, Rupert's horse was knocked from under him and he was forced to hide to avoid capture. He was to take no further part in the battle.
Parliamentarian army discipline now proved invaluable. Instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy, the Ironsides rallied and regrouped so that when Cromwell returned to the field, he found an effective, concentrated force. However, the parliamentarians weren't doing so well on the other side. Sir Thomas Fairfax complained that the gorse and the ditches were impeding his men's progress, but whatever the reason, the parliamentarians were beaten back by Goring's cavalry. However, instead of regrouping like the Ironsides had done, the Cavaliers expended all their energy in pursuing a fleeing enemy and ransacking their baggage trains.
In the centre, the outnumbered Royalist infantry fared even better, pushing steadily forward against the Scottish regiments. Despite inferior numbers, the tide was now turning in favour of the Royalists. On the right and centre, the Roundheads were losing ground and lacking any overall command, panic spread through their ranks. The Earl of Leven, who commanded the Scots, didn't stop running until he reached Leeds.
Just when all seemed bleak for Parliament, Sir Thomas Fairfax made a personal intervention which saved the day. Removing the white cloth from his hat, which identified him as a Roundhead, he charged through the Royalist ranks to alert Cromwell on the other side.
outmanoeuvred by Cromwell and overwhelmed by the timely intervention of the Scots, the Royalist cavalry on the right flank departed the battlefield, leaving their infantry to their own devices. Cromwell then wheeled round and smashed into the unguarded rear of the King's army.
Only Newcastle's regiments, the Lambs, so called because of their white coats, stood firm against the Ironsides' onslaught. They fought for hours until, exhausted and out of ammunition, they were finally cut down by Cromwell's men, in his words, like stubble before our swords. Scarcely a man survived. Marston Moor was certainly the bloodiest battle of the English Civil War. There were perhaps 4,500 Royalists dead, with 1,500 captured. Parliamentary casualties only numbered 300. According to legend, the dead are all buried in this wood. It certainly has a macabre feel about it.
Cromwell's decisive action and well-disciplined cavalry had made all the difference. He became a key figure in the reorganization of the parliamentarian forces and played a decisive role in the final victory over the Royalists. Cromwell was later made head of state and ruled the country as Lord Protector. With defeat at Marston Moor, the king lost control of York and the north of England. The Civil War dragged on for another 4.5 years, but the Royalists were hemmed into an ever-shrinking heartland and found it increasingly difficult to attract support.
At the end of the day, King Charles I fell into the hands of the Roundheads, and when he met his end on the executioner's block in 1649, so ended the divine right of kings. The world would never be the same again.